4 Wildcats against the impossible. The first Zero came out of the sun, exactly where every briefing said it would. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thach saw it as a sliver of white wing and a flash of canopy glass above his starboard bow. A heartbeat later, the radio exploded with warnings. Bogies, 12 o'clock high. Zeeks, at least 8. No, more. Thach didn't answer. His 4 F4F Wildcats were already where no Wildcat was supposed to be, alone, ahead of the main strike group, hanging at 15,000 feet over a patch of Pacific that suddenly felt very, very small. Below them, 15 miles to the northeast, smoke still curled from the crippled carrier. Yorktown. Somewhere beyond that haze, Japanese carriers and their fighters were hunting. Here, in the too bright June sky over Midway, the hunters had found them first. "Skipper, they're climbing on us fast," Ensign Ed Doc O'Hare called from the second section. "You want to dive?" Every instinct screamed yes. The Zero could outclimb and outturn the Grumman Wildcat all day. The only way to win a drag race was downhill. Every pilot in the Pacific had been taught that since December. But Thach hadn't brought his 4 fighters out here to run. He watched the specks above split into 2 groups, 6 sliding out to port, 6 to starboard, both elements angling down to slice across his path. Classic pincer. In a minute or two, he'd have Zeros on his tail and more dropping in from high astern. "Negative, Doc," Thach said calmly. "We're going to try something different." He thumbed his radio to intra-flight. "Blue 1 to Blue 2, turn 30 degrees left, now. Hold level." Roger. Blue 1, came the reply from Lieutenant Noel Gaylor, leading the other pair. 30 left, level. The 4 Wildcats split into 2 pairs, a loose line abreast with a growing gap between them, like thus. A start of a wide, lazy scissors. To the Zeros diving in, it must have looked like the Americans were panicking, spreading out, offering more angles. Easy meat. "Zeros coming down on your tail, Blue 2, O'Hare warned. "You've got 3 tracking you." "I see them," Gaylor answered, voice tight. "What about you?" "3 on mine," Thach said. He eased his Wildcat into a shallow turn toward Gaylor's section, throttles firewalled. "Just like we practiced, boys. Keep it smooth. I'll bring them to you." From above, the Japanese pilots could hardly believe their luck. The lumbering blue-gray fighters had split into 2 groups and were obligingly turning toward each other, exposing their fat bellies and outside wings. The lead Zero rolled onto Thach's tail, nose down, engine howling as he slid into firing position. The Wildcat could not outturn him. Every chart said so. Every scrap of combat footage said so. But what the charts didn't show, what no one on the Japanese side yet understood, was what would happen when 4 Wildcats used each other as moving shields instead of running alone. As Thach's element swung left and Gaylor's right, their flight paths began to converge. The American leader watched the Zeros behind him close in, felt the familiar prickle of fear at the back of his neck as tracers started to stitch the air around his tail. He didn't break. He held the turn. When the angle was right, when the distance between the 2 sections was just small enough, he called it. "Now! Turn in!" Both pairs of Wildcats rolled hard toward each other, like 2 doors slamming shut. The Zero pilots, fixated on their individual targets, followed instinctively, tightening their own turns to stay behind the Americans. In that instant, the geometry flipped. The Zero behind Thach suddenly found himself no longer chasing a single prey, but flying straight into the guns of Gaylor's wingmen. The same thing happened on the other side. A Japanese fighter glued to Gaylor's tail flew right across Thach's nose. Got him. Twin streams of 50 caliber tracers reached out, crossing through the intersection. 2 Zeros disintegrated almost simultaneously, one blossoming into orange flame, the other shedding pieces as it tumbled out of control. "What the? They're crossing us up!" A surviving Zero pilot shouted in his own cockpit, jinking hard as another Wildcat flashed in front of his sights. To outside observers, it looked like chaos. 4 stub-winged American fighters weaving back and forth in a crisscross pattern. Japanese planes sliding into the gaps, and then being spat out, trailing smoke. To John Thach, it looked exactly like what he had seen weeks earlier, hunched over a kitchen table with a handful of wooden matchsticks. The man who refused to believe the charts. Long before the matchsticks, before Midway, before anyone in his squadron had even seen a zero in the flesh, John S. Jimmy Thach had a problem. It came in the form of a thin manila envelope marked Intelligence, Combat Reports, Philippines, Java, Coral Sea. He opened it one wet afternoon in early 1942, aboard the carrier Lexington, nursing a mug of coffee in his tiny cabin. The ship rolled gently. Steam pipes hissed. Other officers played cards or tried to sleep. Thach read. The reports were blunt. Enemy fighter highly maneuverable at low speeds, capable of outclimbing and outturning F4F. Oh, bus. Wildcats unable to stay with enemy and sustain turn. Recommended. Use altitude advantage, diving attacks, avoid dogfights. Pilots report being outflown in every respect, except in a dive, again and again. Ayin, different hands, different battles, same conclusion. The Japanese Zero was better in almost every way that mattered in a traditional fighter duel. Thach knew his own airplane well. The Grumman F4F Wildcat was tough, could soak up punishment, and had good firepower, but it was also heavier, with a stubby wing and a slower rate of climb. Against a Zero that could turn inside it like a knife, the Wildcat's only obvious advantages were in a dive and in survivability. The official answer coming down from Bureau of Aeronautics was simple: avoid dogfighting. Dive in, fire, and dive away. Don't get into turning contests. On paper, it was sound advice. In the gush of reality over the Pacific, it smelled like wishful thinking. Thach had flown enough patrols to know that sooner or later pilots didn't get to choose the perfect engagement. Situations got messy. A junior flyer would chase too long. Someone would get bounced low and slow. Weather, radio failures, simple human error, any of it could pull a flight into the kind of close-in fight the textbooks said to avoid. Telling men, just never do that, felt less like a tactic and more like a prayer. Thach wasn't the kind of man who trusted prayers without a plan. He'd grown up in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, playing with balsa wood airplanes and fishing lines, the son of a pharmacist who believed in careful measurement. At Annapolis, he'd learned the theory of gunnery and navigation. In the cockpit, he'd learned that what saved your life was often something no manual writer had thought of yet. Staring at the combat reports, he had a thought that wouldn't let go. If we can't outfly them one-on-one, maybe we shouldn't be fighting one-on-one at all. But how do you teach 4 planes to act like one animal without getting them in each other's way? That was the problem he carried with him back to his cabin that night, into the wardroom at coffee, onto the pitching carrier deck, and finally home on leave to his small house in Coronado, California. It was his wife who gave him the tool that started solving it. She set it on the kitchen table with a smile. A small, ordinary box of wooden matches. Section 3. Matchsticks on the table. The house was quiet except for the ticking of a clock and the distant hush of surf. War or no war, the Navy gave its men the occasional scrap of shore leave, and that evening in early 1942, John Thach was making the most of his, sitting at a kitchen table with his wife's stew, a cup of coffee, and a knotted ball of tactical worry behind his eyes. "You're not really here," his wife Madeline said gently, watching him push peas around his plate. "You're somewhere over the Pacific with those boys." He managed a thin smile, just thinking about how to bring them back. She sighed, stood, and reached into a cupboard. A moment later she set a small square box on the table and slid it toward him. "If you're going to fight a war in here," she said, tapping his forehead, "at least use some soldiers." He picked up the box, puzzled, and poured a handful of wooden matches onto the tablecloth. They scattered like tiny pale logs. Soldiers, or airplanes. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The checkered cloth turned into a patch of sky. The salt shaker became a ship. The curve of the table's edge suggested a horizon. He picked up 4 matches and laid them in a line abreast. "Wildcats," he murmured. He took another handful and put them above, angled in from both sides. Zeros. For the next hour, he hardly spoke. He moved the matches in slow arcs, tracing imagined flight paths. Single Wildcats against single Zeros always ended the same way. The American forced into a tightening turn, dragged into a spiral it could never win. But when he put pairs together, 2 little sticks side by side, then 2 more opposite, each representing a section, something interesting happened. What? If, instead of each Wildcat worrying only about the Zero behind it, each pilot also thought about being a gun platform for his wingman? He nudged one pair toward the other. The Zeros behind followed. When he crossed the matches at just the right moment, the attacker matches ended up flying into the line of fire of the opposite pair. He pulled them back, tried again at a different angle, different speed. The pattern kept repeating. If 2 aircraft turned toward each other at the right time, enemies chasing them would be forced to cross each other's noses. He sketched rough vectors and altitudes on a pad, then went back to the matchsticks. His wife refilled his coffee, without comment. "It's like a weave," he said finally, half to himself. "Like strands crossing." He arranged the 4 Wildcats in 2 pairs, offset a little. If one pair was bounced from behind, they could turn toward the other pair, drawing the attackers in. Then both pairs could reverse, crossing again, each gaining a shot across the tails of the other's pursuers. Done right, no American would ever be left alone. Every Zero trying to line up a Wildcat would have to expose itself to another's guns. He pushed the matches through their dance again and again until he could feel it, not just see it. The next morning, back on the base, he took chalk to a board and turned his matchstick game into lines and arrows. He called it the beam defense position at first. His squadron would soon give it a better name. Section 4. "Skipper, you want us to do what?" Pilots are not naturally inclined to trust tactics invented on kitchen tables. Out on the flight deck, with the smell of avgas in their noses and ocean wind tugging at their flight suits, Thach gathered a small group around the chalkboard, propped against a stack of ammo crates. "Forget dogfighting," he began. "We already know we can't win that against a Zero. I want you to think of your Wildcat as part of a 4-gun turret instead of a lone fighter." He drew 2 lines representing a pair of Wildcats, then another 2 offset. He walked them through the logic, how one pair would act as the bait, turning just enough to lure Zeros into pursuit, then how both pairs would turn toward each other at the right moment to cross their lines of fire. "Skipper," one lieutenant said, scratching his head, "you're telling me you want me to fly toward my wingman when someone's on my tail?" "Yes," Thach said. "And you want him to fly toward me with someone on his tail?" "Yes." "And we don't hit each other doing this?" "Not if you keep your spacing and your timing," Thach replied. "You've all flown close formation your whole careers. This is the same skill, just used sideways instead of straight." There were snorts of disbelief, a few nervous laughs. "Sir, if those Zeeks are as quick as the boys from the Lex say, won't they just slide inside us before we can cross?" "Not if we do it right," Thach said. "Remember, they're focused on the man in front of them. They're not thinking about the man coming toward them from the side. For once, we're going to make their advantage work against them. To sell an idea like this, you don't start in combat. You start over friendly water." He took 4 Wildcats up that afternoon, 2 sections in loose line abreast. Over the empty blue, 10 miles off the coast, he talked them through it. "Blue 1 and 2, you're the bait. Red 1 and 2, you're the hammer. Blue, fly straight. Red, offset to starboard. Now, red, turn in. Blue, turn toward red. Everyone keep turning, nice and steady." From his cockpit, he watched as the 4 stubby Grummons began to trace the weave in the sky, a double helix of blue-gray shapes, crossing and recrossing. It looked ungainly at first, pilots wary of getting too close. He adjusted their spacing, corrected their timing, ran it again. Then they added fake Zeros. 2 more Wildcats pretended to be attackers, diving in and gluing themselves to the tails of the bait section. "Stay on them," Thach told the mock attackers. "Don't worry about mid-airs, we'll give you room. Blue section, don't break. Red, wait till I call it. Wait. Now, turn in. Through the cross, the attackers found themselves in precisely the position Thach's matchsticks had shown, flying straight into the guns of the other American pair. The gunnery cameras on the Wildcats' noses caught frames of Wildcat silhouettes squarely in their sights. If those had been Zeros, they would have been torn apart. After a few iterations, even the skeptics began to see the potential. "Okay," one pilot said grudgingly back on deck. "So maybe it's not completely crazy. Still doesn't change the fact they can outclimb us." "No," Thach agreed. "But that's why we fly it low and level when we're bounced. You get lower than them, stay fast, and keep the weave tight. Make them dive to chase you. Diving Zeros are predictable Zeros." They started calling it the Thach Weave when they thought he wasn't listening. He pretended to be annoyed. Privately, he prayed he'd never have to use it for real. War, of course, had other plans. Section 5. The Weave Meets the Zero. The real test came on June 4, 1942. The Battle of Midway was already a storm of smoke and falling metal by the time Thach's 4 Wildcats clawed into the air from the carrier Yorktown. American torpedo planes had been massacred. Dive bombers were still searching for targets. Japanese fighters were thick in the sky, prowling for anything that burned the wrong color. Thach's division had one job: protect the TBD Devastators and SBD Dauntlesses still in the area, and if possible, intercept any strafers coming in on the stricken Yorktown. But fighters hunt as much as they guard. When his radar vector called out a large formation approaching at 20 miles, altitude unknown, he nudged his section toward it. They met not a bomber formation, but a swarm. A dozen A6M Zeros from the carrier Hiryu, out looking for stragglers. "They're all over us!" someone shouted as the Japanese fighters spotted the Wildcats and began to fan out. Thach didn't hesitate. "Blue section, throttle up. Red section, move to starboard. Beam defense position, now." Gaylor's pair slid to the right. Thach's kept left. The Zeros picked their targets, some dropping in behind Thach, others lining up on Gaylor. In the chaos of a sky that turns instantly lethal, there is a moment, 1, maybe 2 seconds, when training takes over and doubt falls away. That was the space Thach had built his weave to live in. 3 Zeros dropped in behind his 2 Wildcats, cannons already spitting. He jinked, but not enough to break the pattern. Gaylor's section mirrored him on the far side. "Wait for it," he said, more to himself than anyone. "Turn in. Turn in. Now." All 4 Americans rolled inward. The Japanese, intent on closing to pistol range, tightened their turns, following. As the 2 sections crossed paths, the Zeros swung exactly where the matchsticks had promised, across the noses of the opposite pair at perfect deflection angles. Thach squeezed his trigger. Tracers arced out, not at the enemy behind him, but at the one coming across his bow chasing Gaylor. The Zero filled his sight for a fraction of a heartbeat, then it vanished in flame. On the other side, Gaylor's wingman was doing the same thing to the fighter that had been welded to Thach's tail. Another Zero tumbled away, trailing a black, oily streak. Radio calls overlapped. "One smoking." I got one. "Look out, more high 6. The weave tightened. Zeros dove. Into it again and again, only to find themselves forced to roll through crossing streams of fire. A few learned quickly, breaking off rather than follow their prey into the jaws of the pattern. Others, hungry for kills, rode the spiral down and paid for it. One Japanese ace later told a debriefing officer that it felt like trying to grab a pair of snakes that had tied themselves into a knot. Every time he thought he had one's tail, the head of another whipped around and struck. The Wildcats did not escape unscathed. One took hits in the wing, another lost a tailplane and went into the sea. But the impossible had happened. 4 Wildcats, flying a dance choreographed on a kitchen table with matchsticks, had stood toe-to-toe with superior individual aircraft and come out alive, leaving a trail of broken Zeros behind them. When they landed back aboard Yorktown, or on makeshift strips after she was crippled, ground crews counted victory marks on fuselages and patched holes in wings. Pilots, still shaking from adrenaline, tried to explain to disbelieving listeners how they had flown toward each other with enemies on their tails and somehow lived. The story spread faster than any official directive. By the end of that summer, Thach Weave wasn't just a nickname. It was a line in training lectures, a drawing on chalkboards, a tactic that every new Wildcat and Hellcat pilot learned before they ever saw a Zero's rising sun. From matchsticks to manuals. In the months after Midway, American fighters started dying a little less often in turning fights they had no business entering. Some of that was new airplanes, the F6F Hellcat and F4U Corsair, tilting the performance balance back. Some of it was simple experience, men learning to fight the enemy they had, not the one they'd imagined. But buried in the tide of more obvious changes was a pattern. Wherever the Thach Weave was taught and practiced, losses against the Zero in close-in engagements dropped. Pilots who understood it didn't always have 4-ship divisions to play with. Sometimes they adapted it to 2-ship pairs. Sometimes they used only the spirit of it, never leaving a wingman hung out alone, always thinking in terms of crossing lines of fire rather than individual duels. Japanese pilots noticed. After one particularly frustrating engagement near Guadalcanal in late 1942, a veteran Zero flyer wrote in his log, "Americans now fly in strange crossing patterns. Attacking one brings the fire of another. No longer can we simply choose a target and stay on its tail. When we do, we are struck from the side." On American carriers and island strips, instructors pulled young pilots into ready rooms and moved salt shakers and pencils across tables to demonstrate the weave. Somebody always reached for the matchbox. "Commander Thach came up with this in his kitchen," one old hand would say, laying out 4 wooden sticks on a map. "He got tired of prayers for better planes and decided to change what we could with what we had." It made a good story. It also happened to be true. Thach himself remained matter-of-fact about it. To him, the matchstick trick wasn't genius. It was just problem-solving. "In the reports from the Philippines and the Coral Sea," he said years later, "the thing that bothered me was how often we were surprised and outnumbered. We weren't going to get a better fighter overnight, but we could get a better way to fly the ones we had." By 1943, the beam defense position had entries in official Navy tactical manuals. Diagrams showed 2 aircraft lines curving in toward each other, arrows indicating zones of fire. The word weave appeared in type rather than chalk. On paper, it looked clinical. In the sky, it remained what it had always been, a pattern of trust and timing, invented with matchsticks, paid for in bullets and burned wreckage. Section 7, After the War, a box of matches on a desk. War has a way of turning extraordinary days into footnotes. After the Pacific Campaign, John Thach went on to serve through Korea and into the early Cold War, trading cockpits for desks and then for flag quarters. His name appeared on promotion lists and later on the brass plate of an admiral's office door. In that office, amid the tidy stacks of papers and the frame photos of ships and squadrons, there was usually a small, unremarkable box of wooden matches. Visitors sometimes assumed he was a heavy smoker. In truth, he liked cigars only occasionally. The matches stayed mostly untouched. Every so often, when a young officer came in fretting about a new enemy aircraft or missile that seemed to outclass everything in the U.S. inventory, Thach would pull the box toward him, pour a few sticks onto the blotter, and say, "Show me how they're beating you." At home, on quiet evenings, he could still see the kitchen table in Coronado, the way the matchsticks had first traced the shape of an idea that let stub-winged Wildcats stand up to Zeros they couldn't hope to outrun or outclimb. He rarely talked about the kills. He talked about the pilots who came home. For the men who flew under him in those early days, the memory was sharper. They remembered the fear in their throats the first time he said, "Turn in now," with fire on their tails. They remembered the insane crossing pattern in the sky, the sudden explosion of a pursuer in their peripheral vision, the realization that they weren't alone anymore up there. And somewhere, in the corners of history where numbers are tallied, the legacy of a handful of wooden matches lies in T. He reduced columns of missing and killed in action, that might have been higher if 4 Wildcats over Midway hadn't flown a pattern the enemy didn't expect. They'd never seen his kitchen. They'd never seen the matchsticks. All they knew was that one commander had refused to accept that the chart on the wall was the end of the story. He picked up a box of matches, moved 4 little sticks across a table, and taught 4 Wildcats to destroy zeros they couldn't outfly.